or whatever, you know.
I haven't. I haven't been. I've done a number of these Zoom. I started doing these interviews in person. I was going around with a couple of cameras, but then the world changed. So I've done a few of these now on Zoom. But I have never done what I'm now going to do, which is say that it is day 5 of counting in the American elections. David Leveaux is in America. I'm in London, and I've just heard that Donald Trump is playing golf. It just seems. I think Harold would approve of marking the diary, as an extraordinary moment, really.
It's so funny you say that, because I was just trying to think what Harold would have said, because in a sense, Trump completely embodies, in one man, so much of what Harold had to say about America from his point of view. But it is amazing, though, that the electorate here has managed to navigate its way through, disinformation and quite a deal of pretty naked voter suppression, and arrive at this result. So I'm sort of it's kind of heroic in a way, and
it is.
And if Georgia and Arizona go to Biden, I mean, it sort of tells you that these are long-term changes in terms of demographics, and it's probably why one of the reasons Trump's desperate to hang on, apart from the risk of personal prosecution once he leaves office. But that those Republicans are sort of looking at a world that in 4 years' time, just might not be there, but it won't be there. So, but it's curious, nail biting, really.
I was reading about I can't remember her name, but a lady activist who's being credited with possibly having got 800,000 people onto the register in Georgia. And
yes, this is Stacey Abrams.
Stacey Abrams.
Is extraordinary. She actually ran for election, I think, for governor, and then didn't win. And amazingly, just sort of stayed at it. And she's probably personally responsible for flipping Georgia. I mean, if it goes that way.
But also her model, whatever her plan has been, needs to be observed and applied. Right. And I think Harold would think of her as a really noteworthy and somebody who's embodying something really vital right now.
I think he certainly would. I can imagine. I'm sad he's not around to see this, actually, because I think he would just find it completely forensically fascinating. But it's a hell of a moment.
I almost exactly 12 years ago, I had lunch with him with an American director who I'm sure you know, Emily Mann.
Yeah.
In London. So Obama had just won his first term, and Emily Mann naturally was extremely excited. And over lunch, with champagne glasses raised, Emily said, "Harold, do I dare ask you to say God bless America?" And Harold said, "Well, I wouldn't go that far."
That was very daring of Emily.
She was naturally, very excited.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it's almost a miracle, actually, if Biden does claw this one, that the Trump interregnum, has only been one term, because I don't know that it was survivable, for more. And it's actually, but I had this conversation with Harold too, because I'll never forget the first time I came here, and it was completely fascinating and all new. But this was back in the early 80s, and I remember saying to somebody at the time that you could feel that this is one of those nations, and it could be true of any nation, I suppose, which could very easily flip to authoritarianism and which is indeed what's been so alarming about these last 4 years. And I think it's taken a lot of, well, many of my American friends, by surprise, that such a thing was conceivable in the United States. And it is that thing, where we kind of assume that the democracies, just naturally run deep and robust. But just seeing the amount of peril this one has been in and how rapidly that happened is startling. And I think it's that too is an important lesson, that we all need to take in, and equally true in the UK if we're not very careful.
But I think Harold was prophetic in that sense, because I think it has to be said that he saw this coming, and was extremely vociferous about American foreign policy, at least, as you know. But even more so, the prison gulag, the systematic suppression of black people's rights and so forth. Harold was very vocal about all this for decades, really.
Yeah.
More so towards the end, obviously, but.
Well, yeah, and actually, it's interesting you say that, because I remember thinking, in the period of time when I was working closely with him, I suddenly realized that, in a sense, Harold embodied the real meaning of prophecy, actually, in the sense that, great writers do, but he did it by being in entire command of the facts.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, things that seemed sort of out there a bit to people, whether it be even in the landscapes of the plays, were only provisionally, temporarily out there, and over time, seemed to be the most sort of potent form of reality. It's possible to imagine, and I always felt that about him, that he was. He was a prophet of a kind on so many levels. It wasn't always just, it wasn't always predictive. It was, as it were, his ability to absolutely read the times, in which he lived, and be, completely ruthless about doing so. And, so yeah, he absolutely foresaw this.
I wasn't planning this as a sort of entry point, but you very, very acutely observed that Harold's writing process seemed to have an almost uncanny access to the unconscious, that he seemed to be able to allow a very pure flow when he was in the heat of creation. And he himself described it. You could almost call it a possession state, that he simply had to submit to this energy that made it imperative that he picked up a pen and wrote. He talked about running from a taxi to his writing room when No Man's Land, when he first heard Spooner's first line in his head. So we know about that. So, and I think I think it's a very well made observation, and I'm very interested in Carl Jung and Jungian ideas. Harold, I don't think ever read Jung particularly, but for example, just before you began your amazing run at the Almeida, I did a play there with him called Party Time.
Yeah, I remember.
Which was revived by Jamie Lloyd a couple of years ago in his West End thing, but. That play, it looked at now, 30 years later, seems to have a prophetic element to it. And at the time, critics, intellectuals observed that this was a somewhat hysterical reaction of Harold's. Are you really saying these things are happening here? Surely not, and so forth and so on. But I wonder whether do you ever think, when you're working with writers, with writing or specifically with Harold's writing, in terms of archetypes and his if he's writing from the unconscious, then he's in touch. And this is my Jungian side. But if he's writing from that place, that means he's in direct touch in some very acute way with the world of the archetypes, the place where they dwell, the characters that we meet in stories and myths and so forth in eternity, for eternity, they occupy that place. And I just wonder whether that's ever occurred to you, or whether you think in
it's
those.
Funny. Yeah, that's very interesting. How I don't think I ever really thought about it in terms of archetypes, but I certainly, with his work, felt that they were, how can I put this, mined from somewhere. Of course they were written, but they were kind of, I felt like he was mining something. Mm-hmm. And that thing you'd be obviously very familiar with, I loved it when he did it, which was that if he was in a rehearsal and not directing, but kind of, next to you, and he'd watch something, and he would never say, no, what I meant was da da da. He would say, what seems to be happening here is, it was like it's a phrase that, and I thought, okay, that's very telling, because just to go back to your point about, because I remember saying that about him writing, in an uninterrupted way, from the unconscious to the page. I really felt that strongly, so that when the door shut, he could only barely recall the way back. In other words, it was as if he was visiting the play as a kind of tourist, in some kind of sometimes Hadean sort of way, with a flashlight. And he, for instance, it was always one of the sort of cliches that people would have about Harold, that his determination to be, that you had to be precise about language, was a sort of a kind of, I don't know, pedantry or something. And of course, it was nothing of the sort. I mean, it wasn't just a writer actually wanting the words that he wrote to be spoken, and not a kind of, an improvement on them. But it was also, but it had nothing to do with pedantry. It had everything to do with him almost mistrusting himself to say anything about the plays, because once they were there and on the page, he could not guarantee, that his opinion about them was something, that was quite literally trustworthy. So his skepticism about, when people were, vague around the language, was a skepticism he applied to himself. I think there was a kind of deep respect he had for the thing created, and that wasn't a kind of, a vanity in any way. It was a respect of something, and I think that goes to the core of the fact that he didn't really know where it had come from.
Yes.
And for instance, I mean, another writer with whom I've had a wonderful relationship, is Tom Stoppard, and Tom, will tell you what he intended, what he meant. The plays seem to come from a different place. I'm not saying he doesn't, equally have a sort of a mysterious creative source. He does, but I think Harold's was, in terms of the application of unconscious creativity, was the most extraordinary I've ever encountered, and explained a lot of things in an odd way. So basically, it's a long-winded way of putting it, Harry, but I always had this sensation on working on the plays in the room that if you attended to it properly, you would actually have this experience of things rising to the surface from within the play, you know. So it was like invisible things becoming visible in some way, and I thought that was incredibly exciting. And like you said, I can't imagine Harold reading Jung. I mean, in a way, I think perhaps he just didn't need to, you know.
No, exactly. I don't think it's an omission. I think it's simply whatever he would have found there. I remember him saying to me, I once casually threw in the word shadow into a conversation. He said, "Wait a minute, what do you mean? What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, you know, whatever bits of a human being they would prefer to push behind them where they aren't troubled by it." And he said, "Oh yeah, of course, carry on." But you know, that's a core Jungian concept. But of course, it's I mean, predates Jung by millennia. So we're only grateful to Jung for being so organized about it all. But
gosh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I can also absolutely imagine Harold jumping on the word shadow, because it's a word that would have been very interesting to him.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. I mean, there were those, and there were words and ideas that similarly instantly you knew were not interesting to him. You know, I can't remember. I think I mentioned to him slightly sort of trivially once that because for various reasons, I had to go to the Oscars one year, and some pop star or other was, it was Bjork actually was there. That's who it was, you know, and she was sort of dressed up as this extraordinary swan. And I was trying to explain it to Harold, and I looked, and suddenly he was looking at me and he went, "Well, that's fascinating." And I thought, "Oh, okay, yeah, that's probably not a subject that's actually worth," you know. Anyway, but yeah, I actually just getting back to that precision thing with Harold and the fact that it wasn't pedantry. It's also a function of energy, because he clearly wrote with a certain energy, an enormous energy. You know, I mean, when he showed me Moonlight, well, actually what happened was he called me and he said, "I've written a play." And it was, you know, at a time when he hadn't kind of written anything sort of great length for a while. So that was quite, you know, and obviously, and we were, I think it was between the time that No Man's Land moved from the Almeida into the West End, and suddenly we were, you know, about to come back into rehearsal, and he said, "I've written a play." And I said, "Well, how did that happen?" And his answer was, "Well, see, we were on holiday, and I brought a typewriter with me, and in the mornings I go chung 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 chung, then have a bit of a break, and the next day I'll go chung chung chung, and very shortly I had a play." And I thought, that's a fascinating way of putting it. But the way he did it, which I have not imitated well at all, was a sort of electrifying instance of this almost kind of, you know, lapidary power of words for him, that it was like, you know, the physical act of setting a word onto a piece of paper, you know, just told you a great deal about, you know, where the energy temperature of that language, you know, actually is. I mean, not unlike, you know, I remember when I was at the RSC one season, witnessing Adrian Noble say to an actor who was sort of racing through a soliloquy, sort of on a kind of modern tempo, as it were. And Adrian suddenly said, "No, because you have to remember that when Shakespeare wrote, he wrote like this." And as Adrian did it, it was very similar to that thing with Harold and his typewriter, which was that you almost got a sense of the tangible nature, the sensual nature, you know, of the act of writing. And actually, it was a brilliant note from Adrian because it actually transformed what that actor was then doing. You know what I'm saying? And suddenly, you know, you actually felt this language being coined, really coined, as opposed to surfed. And Harold, I mean, all language has to be coined in a sense, but Harold language particularly, which is why that sense of rhythm and energy and the whole question of, you know, what he referred to as, you know, about these bloody pauses, you know, and silences becomes so important at a absolutely practical level, you know, not literary.
Yeah. I suppose the writers that he loved, especially the poets, I suppose, who could have I mean, W.B. Yeats, but then Yeats had so many different modes of writing as well. But, you know, Henry Miller or W.S. Graham, or, I mean, all these great writers and dramatists that Harold loved, Beckett especially, I suppose. You feel that there is a configuration of that kind of energy that you're describing, obviously imprinted with that writer's character and shape and form, but nevertheless there is always that. Harold loved writing that couldn't have come from anywhere else but the very center of the volcano of a writer.
That's so well said, Eric. You know, and the Beckett thing is fascinating because obviously, I mean, certainly in the time I knew Harold, you know, it was clear that Beckett was the writer to whom he returned, you know, referentially, you know, again and again. And particularly, it was obviously important that, you know, the Beckett was always the person to whom he sent, you know, a new play. And then Sam would write back, you know, sort of pithy. I wish I could remember, and you might know what it was, but because Harold told me once how Beckett had written back his card after he'd read Betrayal.
Oh yeah, that line.
That astonishing line. Do you remember what it was?
Well, the first words of it, I can't remember all of it, but that first last look is the first line. I can probably find it while you're talking, actually.
It's such a brilliant line because it completely expresses the play in a nutshell. That first last look in the dark, was it, with the light of the past yet to come, or something. It was one of those sort of extraordinary.
Yes, the yet to come, the those before and the yet to come is the core, is the absolute core of it. I mean, it's the one.
Yeah,
I can't find it.
And I think I thought that was really interesting because, you know, with Betrayal, I think in the first time Betrayal was done, which was, you know, Peter's production, Peter Hall's production, Michael Billington had sort of slightly dismissed the play as being what he called Hampstead Light.
Yes.
Which was quite a serious misreading of two things, I thought. One was, it was a misreading of the play. But the other thing is that the implication he was making was that suddenly Harold was not, in Michael's terms, you know, being political. And by that he meant, you know, the class of people about whom he wrote. So to Michael it meant, but actually Betrayal is an infinitely more profound play than that. And Harold's politics as a writer don't emerge in the kind of, what you might say, the predictable or the ordinary sense at all. So when I read that, I thought, well, of course Beckett nailed it straight off. He didn't need two bites of the cherry to figure out what was going on in that play.
I found it. Let me just put it in here while you're back there. That first last look in the shadows, after all those in the light to come, a curtain of curtains.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic, isn't it?
Wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
You know, sorry, Howard.
No, don't worry.
Hang on.
Take it if you have to.
I might just click. Hello? Yeah. Oh, is he? Fantastic. Oh, this is great. I am. Yeah, I am. But I wondered if it was that. Okay, see you in a bit. Okay, bye. Oh, Biden, it's official.
No, wow. Oh my gosh. That's really quite exciting.
So it must have been the Philadelphia numbers came in, or Allegheny County, one of them anyway, Pennsylvania. What a relief.
Isn't that great?
That's fantastic.
David, so when did you become aware of Harold as a young person, before you ever met him? What was your first exposure?
It was at school. I had a very enlightened English teacher who introduced us to his work. And I actually have a vivid recollection of, I think I must have been maybe 14, 15 at the time. And he was trying to introduce us to contemporary writing. And the day he handed out copies of The Caretaker, and I opened a book, and in the way these things do, the brevity and the spaces between the lines and the words was like immediately. I thought, this is something quite new. I'd never, I know this sounds sort of like trivial almost, but actually it turned out that it wasn't really a trivial reaction at all. It was very much to do with the fact that there was an instantaneous originality about the words, and so I read that, and I didn't really understand what was going on, except that I just remember it making me very anxious, initially.
Yeah.
And then, so it was then really, and he seemed to be like no other,
What did you see first? Do you remember what your first going to see a play of his was?
It's a really interesting question, and I think it was probably the very first thing. I think was a production actually of The Dumb Waiter, up in the Playhouse at Derby. It was like the first time I was actually been in the room with it, as it were. And then, it is a curious thing, because one of my first sort of jobs, as it were, was being a kind of all-purpose assistant at Riverside. And I had a very interesting conversation one evening with Peter Gill. And I said that I was struggling with comprehending, Harold's work. And Peter said, well, just keep struggling, because it's worth it. There's no one else, like it. He was right. He was actually sort of speaking, as it were, in his royal court hat when he said that, and said, actually, he didn't put it the way I'm about to put it, but the implication was, look, there are some writers that actually shape the world we're living in, and Harold's one of them, I mean,
that would have been around the time that David Gothard brought Beckett over.
Yeah, I became Sam's assistant there while he was working on Waiting for Godot.
God, how amazing! How wonderful!
And actually, it was amazing. I mean, you can imagine he required a lot of assistance. My main job, Harry, was to make sure that he had a half of Guinness at lunchtime, and to sort of keep whatever. But extraordinary, and well, not least because you're sort of hanging out with a sort of a colossus of the 20th century, who sort of takes you all the way back to Joyce, and then Joyce back to Yeats, and that whole thing, and actually I remember Sam, and I'm going to say this because actually, in a way, it was a sort of almost like a Harold joke that Sam made, and he made it completely deadpan, and it was simply by taking something absolutely literally at face value. And it was, I was sitting with him at lunchtime, and, you know, sometimes Sam would talk and sometimes he didn't want to, or whatever. It was very, generally speaking, didn't offer anything or particularly want to talk about his plays. You know, that just wasn't like, you know, he could, you know, talk for Ireland about cricket or rugby, but not, you know. But anyway, so we're sitting there, and I out of the corner of my eye, I see this man come in through the doors into the foyer of Riverside, looking slightly wild-eyed, and you know, and I think a little amber light went off the back of my head, because I just thought, oh, you know, probably being overprotective, and, you know, I just thought, I don't want anything to happen to Sam, you know, on my watch. It would be just awful. Can you imagine? Anyway, he does, sure enough, this man, you know, with a rucksack and everything, he looks around, spots Beckett, and comes over towards us to the table. And he gets there and he stops dead, and he's literally physically shaking. And Sam doesn't react at all, is completely still, and he doesn't even look at him. And this man starts the sentence with, Mr. Beckett, I've been reading your work for 40 years. And then he ran out of words, you know, he was sort of so, and there was what seemed like an endless silence from Beckett. So I thought, I don't really know whether I should be trying to sort of handle it. Sam looks up at him and said, you must be very tired. That is just so pricelessly good. Isn't it? I mean, how good is that?
It's in the same league as Harold's reply to the boy who the father said to the child, this is a very, very famous writer. And the boy said to Harold, can he do W's?
That's right. Actually, you know, it reminds me, speaking of Sam, that Harold also told me that, you know, of course, the thing about Beckett was that he was a completely first-rate critic. I mean, you know, he obviously, you know, he taught literature. He had, you know, it wasn't something he kind of, you know, imagine being taught Shakespeare by him in Paris or whatever, would be extraordinary. And I think that was part of the reason why Harold wanted to keep telling him his plays to sort of get his response. And you might know this, that he said that Harold said when he sent Old Times, you know, he said usually, I mean, you know, Sam just write back up a card or something, you know, like betrayal or whatever it said. But on this occasion, card said, you may need to pay attention to the speech on page 24. And Harold said, what do you mean? You know, and so he said, well, I went and looked at page 24 on the speech. There was absolutely nothing wrong with that. You know, and I just forgot about it, you know. And then, you know, a few weeks later, the play goes into rehearsal and Peter Hall's directing, and Harold said, so, you know, I left him to it for a couple of weeks. And I thought, well, I'll just call Peter and see how it's going, you know. And so I did, and said, you know, how's the rehearsal going? And Peter said, oh, it's going very well, very well. Just wrestling a bit with this, just a small section. And Harold said, it's not on page 24, is it? And Peter said, yo, how did you know? I said, so I went back and I had a look at it, and I suddenly realized that Sam was absolutely right. That, see, what had happened was, what I'd written was not what the character says, but a description of what the character says. And wow. I thought that is fascinating, because of course Beckett spotted it right away, and he said, you're going to have a problem with that. The actor's going to have a problem with that. It's not, in fact, dramatic writing. and then brilliantly, Harold figured it out what it was. But I found that an incredibly exciting insight, actually. And also, it was special about Beckett, and
that there was a real tuning between them. They really were sympathetic towards one another at a very meaningful level.
Yeah, I mean,
personally, obviously, but also as writers.
Completely fascinating, and also they obviously could communicate. As you say, there was a sort of a line of communication between the two. Because I remember Harold telling me just before Sam died, and he was actually, Harold, in a way, not ghoulishly, but was sort of pleased that there was a screenplay of Harold's by Sam's bedside when he died. I think it was Proust, probably. But he said, I called Sam and I said, "How are you?" And Beckett said, "Well, the balance has gone, and I just thought, yeah, that's where they connected, because that's something that Sam immediately knew. He wouldn't have to explain to Harold what that meant, and Harold, similarly.
Well, and Harold born under the sign of the Libra scales. Harold, so balance was of his essence.
Right, that's interesting.
Well,
I actually, I know we're not here to talk about Beckett, but it's a very important sort of part of the Harold landscape for so many reasons. But I'll never forget reading about, it was after he died, Sam, and a journalist recalled that, because he loved sport, as I said, and he liked rugby, and I think rugby league too, which of course is a slightly different game. And anyway, Beckett had been talking about this particular fly half that he admired, and described him as capable of genius when the light is dying. That's, as a rugby fly half, right? But you can kind of imagine if you were, watching a game in Hull or whatever. It just completely summed up that kind of moment on the rugby field, in November or whenever, and yet at the same time was sort of strangely thrilling. I mean, can you imagine who would not want to be capable of genius when the light is dying? I mean, it's the sort of thing that. And actually, it's a sort of, it's very Harold. I mean, might not. It's sort of a line that sort of could have flown out of no man's land or something.
Well, that dying light, in Devon they call it dimpsy, is the word they use for it, and it's literally the magic hour. And many cricket matches are won and lost in that dying light, and extraordinary feats. People take catches where they have no right to see the ball, what I mean? So I can easily see a fly half ghosting through a defensive line. It's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely astonishing.
One of the things Harold said about you was that you had a wonderful ear. And that, for a man who appreciated the music of Bach and so forth as much as he did, and but also some modernist music, I think he was quite interested in too. That must have helped tremendously for him to put his trust in you. But he put more trust in you than, that golden Almeida period is probably under discussed. But I was on the fringes of it too, so I know that Ian McDermott, Jonathan Kent created an environment in which not only did Harold feel comfortable, but and then he brought in people like you, and Jonathan and Ian were all about the values of the National Theatre, but on a theatre that allowed for an extraordinary intimacy and didn't have the problems of scale.
Yeah.
So how, and your collaboration began with Betrayal there.
Betrayal, yeah.
And I would love to hear you reflect on that and how that came about. Had you seen the play? Were you waiting to direct it?
Oddly enough, I had not seen the play at that time. I had read it, but I hadn't seen a production of it. And it came out of the blue a little bit, because I forget where I was at the time, because I wasn't in London, I wasn't in England. And I got this call from Ian, and he said, would you like to do Betrayal? And Harold will be very happy if you direct it. And I didn't really know Harold in person very well. I'd come across him a couple of times, I think once at the National and a couple of other places. So I was actually I was surprised but completely delighted, that he, was entrusting me with it, because it had been a while at that time since Betrayal had actually been staged in London. I mean, since then, it's obviously been done several times. So it was my first encounter, and of course, the first time I had that experience of Harold being, not that he, is there every day in rehearsal, but him being involved, in the production, and his extraordinary tact, actually, about the sort of protocols of the rehearsal room, which he understood very, very well. I mean, partly because, he was an actor himself, but also he just had that. So, for instance, it was something, it's a tiny detail, but I just remember him coming into the rehearsal one day just to see what we were doing. And he sat next to me, near me, and, because I don't usually sit behind a table, so so we're both sat there, and, the actors are doing the scene, and I just instinctively kind of pushed my chair back so that it was, because I was slightly forward of Harold. And the next time I sort of glanced over, I noticed he'd moved slightly back again. And so I moved back. And then it dawned on me that he was doing this deliberately. And the reason why was that he wanted to keep the conduit in terms of anything he was going to express directly to an actor, or through the director. Mm-hmm. So if an actor then asked Harold, since he was there, a question, Harold would sort of go, well, I don't know what you think, David, but he would do. Now, I say this not because I had a particular sort of control freakery about rehearsal, but it was because he just understood something about the channeling of information, and I thought that was quite a surprise, And the other thing that came out of that first sort of encounter with him in the play was, I'll never forget. We did our conventional read through of the play around a table, and Harold was there, and and after that, I just turned to him and said, is there anything you want to say, Harold, to sort of launch us? And he goes, yes, about these bloody pauses, which of course immediately kind of let everybody off the hook a bit. He said, look, if you find one that's not useful, just, cut it, forget it, cut it. Now, what's interesting about that was that we then never did find one that was not useful. and not out of any sort of, because what he was saying was, don't religiously observe something, it either, simply because I wrote that word, because obviously, as he wrote the word pause and he wrote the word silence because they were sort of the most helpful word to describe kind of what he meant at that point, but he didn't want to turn it into a sort of, into the Bible. But it was interesting because he was like simultaneously saying, he was liberating us from something. Mm. But as it turned out, it was very important not to ignore them, because from a musical point of view, to use that, from a musical rhythmic point of view, it's absolutely fascinating that the transmission of thought or the moment, it's often depends on that very precise architecture. I mean, I ended up formulating it just for my own sort of, as it were, sort of note to self, as, a pause being when thought continues, as it were, thought is still in motion, and the silence as being when language fails. And actually, it turned out to be quite helpful, because there's energy in both, but they are quite different. And in fact, I'll tell you something. I mean, you would totally get this. It's funny. I mean, to sort of jump to no man's land, there was an absolutely fabulous moment, because obviously Harold was acting it, and at the Almeida, they only had those two small dressing rooms, and one of them, had been commissioned to be Harold's hospitality suite, which meant they had a fridge with champagne in. So all four guys were in one room, So this gave rise to a certain amount of camaraderie. But I don't forget going in there one evening to give a couple of notes, and one was for Harold, and the note was it said, when you get to that point, we just need to, I think you need to leave it. You're moving on a bit too quickly, and I think it's difficult for the audience to make that corner if you move on too quickly. And Harold got quite prickly about it. Well, there's another experience. I think they want to get on with it there, at that point in the evening, which was quite typical of Harold, because he liked, he didn't want to mess about. He wanted to sort of, urgency was a thing. As you can tell, from his film work, it's absolutely fascinating. And that, so anyway, it was back and forth, and the other guys, Gorn and Dougie Hodge, Gorn Granger and Douglas Hodge, were sort of almost hiding their thoroughly enjoying the contest. And I thought, no, I'm going to stick my ground. I'm going to stay my ground here, because I'm certain I felt it. I just felt it was one of those minutes where you just thought, oh no, you just need to let that beat settle before we can do and so we're losing something as a consequence. Back and forth we went, and finally, it occurred to me and said, okay, well, let's has anybody got the script? And I think Dougie handed me the script over his shoulder without looking, and I grabbed it and opened it up to this point, this speech. And I had completely forgotten that right there, the point I was talking about, he had written silence. And I thought, oh, well, here we go. So I said, well, that's interesting, Howard, because actually, it does say silence there. And I'd say, I think that is what I'm feeling, but that's not happening. And it was there for a reason. And there was this pause. And then Harold turned to the others and said, well, what the director is telling me, that when the writer wrote silence, he bloody well knew what he was doing. And I shall observe the note. But, there's a sort of, not serious, but yeah, serious silence, because it's interesting that those pauses and those silences, they all have, as I say, they're not literary. They're thought in motion, or not, or and his understanding of that is just extraordinary. And I have seen a production of Betrayal, and I'm not even going to say whose it was, because, you know, by somebody very favorite who had decided, as it turns out, so listen, let's just do this and ignore the pauses and the silences. We'll just, you know. And unfortunately, it just didn't work. Not because it just didn't work, because it was almost like a whole aspect of the unheard was not in the play.
Mm-hmm.
And in Harold's plays, you know, as much is unheard as is heard. And it's rich. But I mean, it was just, I often think of that moment, that dressing room that I made, because I thought, well, actually, this just goes to prove what an extraordinary writer he is, because you know, that I could feel it in the theatre. I could just feel like the audience not quite, you know, and he'd understood that there was a hinge there.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying? And I thought that was fascinating. And one other thing from No Man's Land. Well, listen, stop me if I'm burbling on.
It's rich. It's very rich. I mean, I don't have many questions, but this is exactly what I hope.
Well, just on No Man's Land, something happened that I think was like the first run through we did, and it was one of those run throughs where everybody seemed to be pausing all over the place, and, you know, including Harold. I was like, sort of, you know, and what the consequence was that the thing was sort of getting more and more, well, my word for it was getting more and more enigmatic,
right? Pinterest,
in a way that's totally not what Harold is about, you know, because he doesn't create false enigma. I know people sort of talk about, you know, the mystery, the enigmatic nature of his whatever. No, it's not. It is, as I say, it's actually about being in command of the facts. It's quite the reverse of enigmatic or mysterious. But if you put in pauses and silences and all over the shop, it sort of becomes, you know, portentous in an enigmatic way. Of course, part of the consequence of that is it becomes, and this is important, it becomes less funny where it needs to be, and you know, to sort of cannibalize another writer. I'll never forget Tom Stoppard saying to me once during previews of his play Jumpers at the National, when he said, "Oh, you see, the thing is, I know it's probably annoying that I keep talking about we're not getting the laugh in that particular place. You probably think I'm being very cheap." And I said, "No, I don't think you're being cheap." He said, "No, but I just need to explain that I think of laughter as the sound of comprehension," which is great insight. So to get back to Harold No Man's Land and these pauses going on in this, which were all over the place, and they were not, you know, in addition to what was there. So there was no, it just felt, you know, I could tell, but it was first run through and all that. So afterwards, when I was giving notes, I said, listen, we had to be very careful, you know, of not indulging in pauses and silences, because it actually makes the play less clear and less accessible, and all sorts of things happen. And by the way, the worst thing is that it's, you know, it creates a sense of enigma, which is not what we're trying to do here. And so Harold, absolutely, as an actor at that moment, said, well, yeah, David, I mean, to if I may come to the defense of the company, that, you know, it was our first run through, and, you know, I'm sure we were putting, you know, and I actually, I just thought, no, I just cannot let you get away with that, because, you know, my worry is that we'll start falling in love with some pauses and silences, will become innate to the rhythm of this thing. And as soon as that happens, you know, we're going to get lost. It's going to become, and the word came out, and I said, it, you know, the worst thing I can say about it, it'll become Pinteresque. And Harold went, well, good God, we don't want that. So I said, yeah, absolutely, that's what I'm talking about. Because, you know, it was interesting, because, I mean, you know, we've all seen Pinteresque productions of Pinter, you know what I'm saying, and they can become portentous and enigmatic, which is quite the opposite of where the writing is, which is, your references are better off being, musical than, terrible word, but, than absurdism or any of the isms that people, apply. So, yeah, that was quite a journey. And the thing about No Man's Land, precisely because it is, anyway, completely, daringly, its landscape is so strange and yet weirdly familiar, that unlike a play like Betrayal, where there is sort of, even when they're going backwards, that there's a narrative that is, No Man's Land is a balancing act, because it's not an obvious narrative. So therefore, for clarity, it became super, super important that we didn't mislead an audience with suggesting meaning or intent where there was none, only a silence, but I loved working with Harold in that process, because he did, just before we started, we had a drink, and I said, look, I tell you what, the only thing I want to say is, and this is the first time actually I used the word Pinteresque. I said, yes, and I'd forgotten I'd used it. I'd used it in conversation with Ian or Jonathan or whatever, and they had passed it on to him that I'd said this. And he said, yes, well, I heard that you use that word. I said, yeah, well, I just think, we don't want to make this Pinteresque, but the way I mean that. He said, I absolutely do. And so I had my first note, and very good. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, I just need to ask you if the way we should do this is, you come to the rehearsal as an actor, let me, as far as I can, protect the play. And then on Fridays, we can have a drink and you can be the writer. And so and it worked incredibly well, actually. And I think it was, I loved watching the pleasure he took in acting, not having to sort of, having that kind of responsibility. And I don't think it was accidental that, the pleasure of that and the energy of that and sharing the dressing room with those guys and being on stage, that actually suddenly, he goes and writes Moonlight.
Whose idea was it for him to play Hearst?
Oh, that's interesting. I think it might have been Antonia's.
Because I think, is it true to say that yours was the first revival? In London?
It was, yeah.
I mean, the shadow of Gielgud and Richardson would have put plenty of people off. And then the solution is for Harold to play the part.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a feeling that the entire venture was Antonia's idea. So I think even then, she may well have said, or Harold, I don't ever remember, other than, Harold might have said it to me as a courtesy or something, which is, which do you think I should play? But I don't ever recall it being a possibility that he would play Spooner, because it just temperamentally, whatever. But it's an interesting question, that. But I definitely remember Antonio was the architect of, the whole project, as it were. And then along came Paul Eddington, who was sort of...
He wasn't well at the time, but...
Yeah, we didn't know. I mean, because I worked with Paul again after that on the David Story's play Home, and when he really was sick. But we didn't know, or at least he wasn't alluding to it. But he just understood it, in such a brilliant way. And what was great, the read through of No Man's Land was quite something, because the minute Paul opened his mouth, it was just flatly hysterical, and it just went on from there.
I mean, a comic actor, incredible genius.
Incredible genius. And so, which was the great beauty. That's the wonderful thing about having, which is, it's a bit like, a completely different writer, but Brecht, you want comedians to be doing this stuff, because they will take you everywhere. And also there's something about, how Harold writes. So of course he was like perfect. And from the minute he said, do you often hang about Hampstead Heath? The place erupted. And then it just went from, and it got funnier and funnier. And that night I got a call from Harold who said, I'm a bit worried. I said, why? About what? He said, well, if it's going to be that funny, I don't know how to stop laughing. And I'm worried about, performing. And I said, but you get used to it. So it actually said, that is a great problem to have, Harold,
so true what you just said about Brecht. If only people really cast funny actors in Brecht, it would all be different, wouldn't it?
Well, it really would. And by the way, let's not forget where all those incredible, comedians from Joan Littlewood's theatre company at Stratford East came from. And they were doing, very similar work in a way. And she deliberately, acquired comedians to do that stuff. And I mean, I know this personally about Brecht, because Brecht's daughter, Barbara, invited me to East Berlin back in the day to work with Eckhard Schall, her husband, Brecht's son-in-law, who was, of course, famously his great Arturo Ui. We did a Strindberg together. But one of the brilliant things about Eckhard was, it was immediately clear that he just was a natural clown.
Right.
And with that, you kind of really understood, oh, that's what Brecht did. He populated his company in a very similar way with these people. Why? Because they have this wonderful ability of, laying an absolutely perfect table and then suddenly tipping it over, great sort of creators of not even of anarchy, but something kind of incredibly kind of radical about that ability to not let you depend on a fixity of reality,
right.
And it was a moment with Eckhard in Berlin which totally sort of demonstrated that to me. And it wasn't even something he did intentionally. It was just that I'd said to him something. I said, so his we were doing the Dance of Death. So I said, his friend Kurt and his wife Alice are having this scene together, and he gets jealous and whatever, And I said, so okay, when you come past the window on the way in, just notice them, that's all. So he goes, yeah, okay. And we start the scene. And the next thing that happens is that Eckhart appears, climbs through the window into the room, and proceeds to carry on. And I kind of went, I said to him, that's extraordinary. Well, I didn't quite like it, but it was very funny, and it was very sort of odd and Strindbergian. I said, but that is what made you think of that? He said, oh, sorry, I thought that's what you asked me to do. And I thought it was a bit strange, but I thought, well, he asked, so I'll try it. And I thought, wow, okay, that's kind of wonderful, isn't it? Going back to real, comedians do the serious stuff.
I got to say, I mean, I did cast Lee Evans in The Dumb Waiter, and that's exactly the kind of thing Lee would have done. He would have found it funny to be literal, and then said, "But that's what you asked me to do."
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely, it's so liberating, isn't it? Yeah, and so surprising, and in the best possible sense, subversive. Which is what I also kind of love about Harold's work, which is that there's something intrinsically subversive about it. It subverts the cliches of familiarity, all the time, because, as I said at the beginning of this, the man, and I said this to him, that he just was in command of the facts. And when you're that in command of the facts, the world you're looking at it appears to be strange, but it is reality, and eventually, of course, it catches up.
I think it was Lindsay Duncan the other day who said to me that she'd seen Max Wall playing Davies. That was her first exposure, and I just, my heart throbbed with pain for having missed that. I would have loved to have seen that.
That's interesting, because I think in one of maybe it was the first edition of that play, there was a photograph of him. I just seem to recall playing.
I think it was at Greenwich. Alan Strachan did it, but
right.
But that must. I mean, I saw Maxwell doing Godot at the Roundhouse. So
yeah.
You just know that Maxwell doing Pinter would have been glorious.
Yeah, fantastic. And I mean, I think it's interesting actually, because you just made the Beckett connection again, because I'd also say that's true of Beckett's work. That comedians, or in the true sense, clowns. And I know that's the cliche of how you do Godot, but actually, real clowns. Obviously, Max Wall was one, and I thought of Eckhart as being one. And that's what I really should have said. Is in many ways that Brecht, brought a company of clowns together. And that's. But it is equally true of Beckett. Oh, thank you. Just celebratory coffee for our president. And I find that really interesting, because I think it is also something to do with that thing that Tom said about laughter. Tom Stoppard said that laughter is the sound of comprehension, and there's no doubt about that. That keeping keeping a certain amount of just reckless joy about it in the rehearsal with Harold's stuff becomes very important, because actually that's also how it becomes sometimes very dark and very sinister, that there is something you need to keep it a little bit dizzying, in some way, and not let it settle.
Well, that goes very much back to where we came in with talking about the unconscious and things. You spoke of things emerging, and that zany irreverence is another perfect way of allowing other things then to float to the surface it's a kind of permission actually in rehearsal.
It's really well put, Harry. I think that's exactly what it is. It is a permission. It's very important, because it's serious play. And yeah, I know we often sort of use this, but it's one of the most difficult things to do. Is just maintain proximity to the giddiness of joy or the funny,
Well, I was talking to Henry Wolfe last night, and Henry talks a great deal about their love and devotion to the radio comedy of the period. It's that man again, and the silly voices and people saying ludicrous things that mean nothing, but audiences roar at because it's done with total conviction and devotion. And Harold, as we know, he adored that kind of comedy. He grew up in it. It was his. Oh,
I mean, absolutely, and so important. That whole section in No Man's Land, which is all about Bunty, was just. I mean, it's like that. Absolutely, could be out of the most extraordinary radio comedy of. I mean, it's like something out of the Goon Show or something. It just, but it's so beautifully observed. It's like. I suppose, it's an extraordinary section, actually, because it is somewhere, Harold pulls off this conjuring trick where he manages to get Terence Rattigan and the goons to sort of enter the same space all at the same time. And you think, how is this done? Because it's amazing poetry, but it's giddily funny. And also, by the way, it's one of those moments you talk about, the music of Harold, but I just knew immediately that it was designed, that section, to be played, as an allegro, because that it actually had to be. And so one thing we did in that production, I just remember, was I said, look, we've got to slightly change the time signature in this without flagging it at the audience. But there was almost like the sort of thing going. So there was this, we need to accelerate the pace of the thought and the language just in this section. So it's like, what was going on? And there's something there, this kind of extraordinary allegro of envy about Bunty from Cambridge, which was sort of like played out like a sort of perfect, English comedy, really. And I think a lot of my references, not necessarily shared with the company always, but when directing Harold's work, have been more, as it were, the history of comedy from Congreve to Pinter than it has been, the history of absurdism or whatever. That's because you're on the wrong boat there, and I think it's what's again, it's like that Sam joke. Harold did something because I also think this was his way of seeing the world. I mean, it wasn't a literary construct. It, as you said earlier, it came directly from the source, from the source of who that particular persona was. And I introduced a rule in No Man's Land rehearsals because I had to, really, because every one of those four guys had 1,000 anecdotes to tell. And, a lot of them were kind of very funny and whatever. And of course, naturally, they'd compete, to tell a better one or whatever. And very quickly, I realized, well, look, if this goes on, the first part of the rehearsal day is going to disappear with everybody kind of trying to tell a better story than the last person. So I introduced this rule, which they all absolutely agreed to abide by, which is, okay, it's got to be one person and one anecdote a day, and no one else is allowed to do it. And then you all have a turn.
Right.
Because funnily enough, as a group, they quite like rules. It's sort of like, it was the thing that, So anyway, one day it's Dougie Hodges' turn, and he starts talking about this real thing that happened, which actually was pretty horrifying. And it was about a friend, a young woman who was out with friends one night at dinner, and she gets this call from her neighbor, says, I think you better come back because you've had a break-in. The police are at the house and some of your stuff is sort of out on the front porch and whatever. So she goes back and she's living alone. And they say, yeah, there were two of them. We got one, the other got away, but we'll get him. Now we've got this one. And she said to this police officer, would you mind coming with me, into the house just to look around and just to double check, there isn't anything kind of worrying. And they say, oh, it's fine. We've checked it out. I mean, the guy he made off kind of up the road and over the fence and whatever. And oh, right. So fine, but she kept pleading with him, and finally said, yes, all right, I'll come in with you and we'll just go around the house. So they go around and look at the kitchen, they look in the living room, and whatever. And they get into the bedroom, and he looks under the bed and the whole thing, and opens the cupboard, and there's this man in the cupboard in her bedroom. And anyway, in many ways, it's quite a sort of Pinter story. Do you know what I mean? As Dougie was telling it, he got to that point, he got to the punchline, and he goes, I mean, imagine, there's a man in the cupboard, in your bedroom. And Harold, who said not a word throughout the entire story, said, "That's all you need." I was, imagine a man in the cupboard in your bedroom. That's all you need. It's just inherently. I mean, he would have written that line if somebody had. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
It was an absolutely brilliant moment.
I do. And I also remember a story that Mick Goldstein used to tell from way back in the 50s, and I can't remember what it was that Mick said, but Mick said something like that, and Harold was reduced to a weeping paroxysm of laughter. So he was receptive to that, as well as being able to pull it out of the ether.
Oh, so much so, yeah. There's a quality of Harold's that I should also mention that seemed very powerful to me. Is my only way of expressing it was, I rarely, if ever, met someone who is more emphatically in the present tense than Harold. And this goes to the core of his writing as well. And by that, I simply mean it is extraordinary that, and I actually remember saying it to the company of No Man's Land. I said we should, because there were a couple of them decided, I think Dougie and Gorn decided they needed a backstory, to figure out where they'd been up the King's Road and, car, whatever, all that stuff. And I said something along the lines of, but see, the problem is, it's no, you have to think of it as being like a dream in the sense that everything is in the present tense, that you don't come in trailing anything. You're not there until you come through the door. There is nothing else. And if you do try to drag stuff with you, as it were, into the room, a backstory, almost instantly, the energy of the event sort of hemorrhages, because his plays are very much made up of this moment of what I call suddenness. Suddenness is an absolute key to Harold. You cannot take the edges off the suddenness by building an offstage story. There is nothing. It begins. It's like Strindberg in that way, which is it begins as you come through that door. And it was not really until there was a production of The Room at the Almeida that they did, which, am I right, is that his first play?
Yeah, which he directed in 2000, with Celebration as the other half of the.
That's right. And whenever he wrote that in the 50s, I was so stunned. I mean, it wasn't that I hadn't read it before, but it's just I'd not seen it before. And I thought, this is amazing that this was made in the 50s, because it must have been absolutely startling that its ability to conjure up what I've just called the present tense in that is so potent. And, there's that incredible moment when, the man who's had his tea and he's got his chauffeur's cap and he goes off to go to London Airport. And then the woman, is sort of dusting the coal, then picks up the coal bucket, whatever, and then walks across the room, opens the door, and there's a man standing there.
A couple.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. It's a couple. And as I was watching that, I thought, that's exactly what I was trying to get at about No Man's Land, which is that I don't think Harold knew what was behind that door until she opened it. I mean, I quite literally think, and that's why I had this fantastic thing, which is that he discovers those moments, but that's what creates this particular unique landscape about Pinter, is the fact that I fundamentally believe it's nowhere other than in the present, and it will not, and you cannot, and it seems funny to say this about, since Betrayal goes backwards, but it's a similar, scene for scene for scene, there is no softening and no escape from the present. There's you can't, there's no comfort in nostalgia that is any part of Harold's landscape. And I find that really interesting. And without getting kind of tendentious about it, I forget who said it about, and weirdly, it might have been Beckett, but described Nietzsche as living under the white hot sun of torture. And now I don't know if it was Sam that said that or what, because I later, when I was working with him or watching him work, one of the things that struck me about Beckett, which I think in a different way, but is fundamentally true of Harold, is that the miracle of Beckett was that he managed to find in the world, as it were, the post-1945 world of what I'll describe as it's a shadowless landscape. It is an absolutely shadowless landscape where there are no shadows of comfort. That's the nature of, and yet in that ruined, shadowless landscape, Beckett miraculously could find a song. And that's what's so incredibly moving. And I feel in many ways the same thing about Harold's work, which is that in the way that Sam's, or at least I think what he claimed to be his favorite novel is the 19th century novel Effie Briest, which actually makes a brief appearance in Crap's last tape because he just suddenly says out of the blue, goes Effie. Now, Effie Briest, is in many ways, it's a kind of romantic, German novel end of the 19th century. But when you have those melodies, as it were, of 19th century narratives, and then along comes a modernist and then a postmodernist like Beckett or like Pinter, it is quite wrong to think that these landscapes don't themselves contain melodies, and their writers don't have, melodies. It's just that you don't hear them. They're played in a different way, in a different order, but they're just as rich. An example would be, because I remember somebody once saying to me, and it really irritated me, it was a director who just decided to be very funny. He said, I don't know why you do all this Strindberg and 19th century stuff. He said, I'm a 20th century and an 18th century man myself. And I thought, what on earth does that mean? And I said, well, what in the 20th century, for instance? And he said, inevitably, he goes, well, Beckett. And I slightly kind of cheekily or sardonically said, oh, yeah, well, to mention one great 19th century writer. And yet I meant it, in the sense that where's the spring? Anyway, the example I was about to give was I went to this concert. You said that Harold, of course, was incredibly sensitive to music and, and as you said, also modern music. Anyway, I went to a concert. It was nothing to do with Harold, but it was a solo piano, and the concert was in two parts. It was all Schoenberg, and the first part of the concert was pre-12-tone system Schoenberg. In other words, you might as well have been listening to Liszt. It had the 19th century melodies and whatever. And then the second half was the music that most people associate with Schoenberg, which is, as I say, the post-12-tone chromatic stuff that he was doing. And, suddenly you get, the plinky plonk Schoenberg, the modern. What was staggering and a revelation about that process, and I'm not a trained musician by any means, I'm just fascinated by it, was that you could hear every one of those melodies from the first half of the concert, but they were implied, not laid out.
It becomes subtextual.
Absolutely, and yet the richness persists. And the reason is that it's almost like artists of the order of Harold and Sam. they are quite consciously retuning your ear, saying, no, the thing is, you think you heard, you think you know that tune, but you don't. So I'm going to put it in a different way and renew for you the contract with that beauty.
Mm.
And when you add to that and renew for you that contract in a way that is absolutely shockingly present, startling, when you add to that what I just said about, Sam's landscape and Harold's landscape, that these are modernists who do not shy away, from the darkness of, post-romanticism, and yet can have flights of extraordinary romanticism, but it's not, that last scene in The Shadows of Betrayal, sometimes it touches a poetry and a romance, frankly, that is right up there with the balcony scene of Romeo and Juliet sometimes. I mean, it is extraordinary. And yet, of course, it's had to be done in a modern way, but it's beauty, and I use the word advisedly, it's staggeringly beautiful. And I think that's partly because, he was able to rescue, like Sam, he was able to rescue incandescent beauty from the cliches of despair sometimes. And that's an extraordinary thing.
And I think there's plenty of evidence from the Lucky Women that's who Harold was when he was in love.
Yeah, totally.
So he wasn't just doing it to be a writer. It was because when he was in love, that was how he expressed it, which I just think is gorgeous.
It's really true. I believe that about him. And I remember, it's funny actually, because I didn't really often, but I did, the last time I saw Harold, he asked me to have lunch with him, and I kind of realized later that he was sort of, in that way that he did, and that he just wanted to say goodbye, basically. But we didn't talk about that, obviously we talked about, the weirdness of him getting the Nobel Prize, which he told, of course, in a classically funny way, which is, how he'd fallen in the street in Dublin and cut his head and had to go to hospital, and and then had to come out, and then he goes, poor Antonia, and had to put up with that, and and then we finally get home and the phone's ringing, and I pick it up and somebody says, you've won the Nobel Prize, and he goes, and Howard goes, and I thought, funny life sometimes. Yes. Anyway, it was a total story, and then again he went back to talk about Antonia and how she was helping, whatever. And it just came out. I said, and I fundamentally believed it. I said, Antonia strikes me as being one of those people who's actually talented at love. And I said, because, let's face it, any fool can be in love or fall in love. But actually, I think some people are actually talented at it, and others not so, I wouldn't want to. And he latched onto that, Harry. He just, at that moment, he kind of went, oh, yeah, do you mind if I tell her that? And so, no, of course I don't. But I was, yeah, very, very important, this, because, to sort of put it in a nutshell, that aridity has nothing to do with it. And you know what I'm saying? And I think that's as true of Harold as it's true of Beckett. And that's why saying I'm a 20th century man and an 18th century man makes absolutely no sense, as if there's something mawkish and romantic about the 19th century. No, it's, these springs, run through great artists, and God, and Harold was one of them. And I think it wasn't it Noel Coward who said, that every generation has its writers who can, write about the world, as it is at the time. But there are very few people, and very few who actually change the way we hear the language.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a wonderful definition. And you would have to say that of Harold.
Mm.
And you'd have to say it of Beckett. And that's a very great distinction. And it's not taking anything away from, the writers who don't do that. It's a different thing. But when you say, if that's, and weirdly, actually, Noel Coward was probably another one of them. And I don't think he was talking about himself at the time.
Is it true that Beckett wrote in French and then translated back?
Correct.
You know that none of Harold's grandparents spoke English very much.
No, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Well, it's interesting in the sense that along with people like Nabokov, Conrad, that in some sense there is, for a writer who doesn't have the English language in their DNA, there is sometimes this irresistible impulse to kind of reinvent the language because it's somehow not in the wiring. And that's in some ways true of Harold.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's true of Stoppard.
And it's true of Stoppard.
Yeah, and it's true of Conrad. As you say, and Nabokov, but I think that's absolutely true. That by coming as strangers, as it were, to the language, it itself has a particular vividness with some artists, and who then can make you hear it utterly differently. Funny enough, I often thought it was helpful to think of Noel Coward sometimes while working on Harold stuff, And I know there was they had a couple of encounters, Noel Coward, because I think in the beginning, Noel Coward didn't get the birthday party, and then came around to thinking, wait a second, this is the real deal.
Well, Coward was one of the producers of the Caretaker movie.
Right.
So he came around Harold in a big way. They adored each other.
Yeah. Well, and you can see, there's a shared thing there, which is fascinating. I'm trying to remember the name of the Coward play that's almost never done, but it was banned by the censor because it was anti-war. And
well, I did that. I can tell you that because I'm the only person who's played the part. It's called Post-Mortem.
Is that what it is? Because it's about the guy who's shot in the trenches and has a moment to go back and visit everybody.
I played it.
Did you play at the King's Head?
I did.
Oh, well, I saw you play it, Harry. Sorry, that's terrible. But I just remember watching that. That line
40 years ago.
That line. Because I'm sort of talking about it being, being censored because it was pacifist. But when that line about, mother love, the best sex I've ever had, or whatever it was, came out, I thought, I don't think it was banned for its pacifist inclinations. But I also thought given when that line was written, I thought that's Harold. That's like one of those, those sort of hothouse moments where you go, wow. And I find this really interesting because I think I've written this somewhere, and maybe it was for some piece, I don't know, in the Independent or something, I was saying, there are certain adjectives that attach themselves to writers, like, barnacles to a whale, I think is the way I put it, and so, like Stoppard is dazzling, and, Pinter is enigmatic, and then these barnacles, these cliches are of absolutely no use in rehearsal. In fact, they're worse than no use. They can actually intervene between you and what the writing is really doing. And I think that, it is very interesting when you think of those ley lines, that run between, a writer like Noel Coward and Harold, or, how much it can change the way you think about Coward, and because people associate Coward with a certain thing, which is sort of high style and all of that. And yet actually an extraordinary subversive darkness, in
and
him.
it's a genius for listening as well. It's the ear for human insanity and so on. Listen, David, there's two things I want to talk about before I let you go.
Yeah,
we've gone long, which is just lovely, and it's been really rich to hear about this, all these reflections. Two things. One, I would love to, because I didn't see it. I wish I had, because I'm a huge Binoche fan. When you cast Binoche, maybe this is a bigger question about casting, but I think of Binoche as somebody with she cannot conceal her emotional depths. She is a soul. She is a personification of the feminine soul, and a great actor. How did that work? How and did it work for the play when certain English actresses have almost made their names playing Emma as cool and sang-froid and stuff that I would have thought Binoche would struggle to bring.
You're right, and in a way, here's the thing. First of all, I thought she was extraordinary, and it came about because I think just before that, I had actually done a production of Betrayal or Trahison in Paris. Not with Juliette, but actually with a Belgian-French company who were kind of making, and Harold came to see that, and he said, it's like some of the best acting I've ever seen in this play, in any production. These actors are extraordinary, and they were, and very different from that kind of what the cool thing you're describing. And actually, when we did it at the Almeida, because it was Cheryl Campbell, and Cheryl, not particularly cool, either. And so in a sense, I think all my encounters with Betrayal, I was sort of slightly working against that, that typing of her. And in Binoche, the thing is, she's so quick. It's absolutely extraordinary because you're watching speed of thought just run through her. So there's a sort of febrility about it that kind of made for an extraordinary kind of, I can describe it as heat. I mean, it was, and
that present moment discovery, suddenness you were describing as being so crucial, she would bring that.
Yes, and actually, emotionally, it wasn't like she was like revealing everything, but it was present. It was so present. It wasn't withheld. It was present and startling. Like from the first moment you laid eyes on her, and you just went, "Oh God, that's like," because she's all those things you described. So yeah, I think in a way it was. There's nothing wrong with people playing Emma cool, but there's two things about the thing about Emma is that the absolute key, I think, is it's her emotional intelligence. That's what Harold captured so brilliantly, and also what makes the play particularly challenging and in a fascinating way, because I always feel that Emma's like streets ahead of both the guys on so many levels, which is she knows exactly what she's doing in creating a home before Jerry even notices that's what she's done, and so on and so on, and it absolutely throws up the fascinating challenge of how did this start? Why would a woman of that emotional intelligence become involved? And that's the key to that very last scene, which is why it's not good enough to have Jerry who's just playing it drunk, because if that were the case, or you should feel that woman would never have anything to do with it. But he reaches her, and and it's just that much more interesting to me. If what you're not looking at sort of cool English restraint with somebody slipping into something they didn't mean to slip into. And Juliette, I just felt had all those qualities.
I think that's wonderful. I totally get what you're.
I'm sorry you didn't see that actually, Harry, because I've been interested to get your view on it. And as I say, Harold, when he was talking about the French production, the one in Paris, he just had a very strong response to it because it was like a French movie. I mean, they were that fast; they were completely extraordinary, and his whole situation of that triangle. I mean, it was like not because of anything I did, but it sort of was absolutely like watching, a Jean-Luc Godard movie or something. And that situation was beautiful. I mean, it was so right for that temperament. And then I was slightly irritated when Ben Brantley who reviewed the one in New York at the time, said Binoche's miscast as Emma. And I thought, no. First of all, you can't miscast Juliet. And secondly, what you're telling me is that you think of the character and the play in a certain way that doesn't fit this, but that's very limiting. And I don't think it was just me that thought that about what Brandt had written there, because I actually got a call when I got back to London. I had a message on my machine from another New York critic who said, "That man's an idiot." Anyway, I thought she was an absolute revelation, and it's a great.
I guess there's no video record of that. But the other thing I'd love you to just reflect on a little bit more is the being given a play of Harold's to direct the world premiere of, to create for the first time, Moonlight, and how did you approach it? Was Harold more involved with that one in terms of rehearsal, a play that had never been done before?
He wasn't more involved, but we did have a long conversation about several conversations, and it was fascinating, because sorry, I've just got to double check something, because I forgot. I know I've got to do another Zoom, and I wouldn't. Forgive me, Harry. Check. Okay. Yeah, I've got to let you in 10 minutes. Sorry. You know what happened was he brought it into a rehearsal when we were re-rehearsing No Man's Land for the West End, and it was in a brown envelope, and gave it to me. And of course, I was incredibly excited. And I went home and I read it, and I thought, this is extraordinary. And there was something about it that I just couldn't put my finger on what it was. And so I thought, okay, I'll read it again. And by the time I'd done that, I thought, oh, it's too late. I don't want to call Harold at this hour, which of course was completely idiotic, because by the time I did call him next day, I think it was Antonio picked up the phone. He said, "Oh, thank God you called, because we were about to go to Scotland." He didn't think he could go until he'd heard back from you about the play. And I thought, yes, it doesn't matter that it's Harold Pinter. He's given you his play, and you should have called him any odd hours. It'd been better. Anyway, he said, "Oh," and I said, "I just think it's absolutely extraordinary." But the thing that I didn't mention to him at that time was that it had occurred to me in the middle of the night what was like knocking at my head, and it was the girl pacing about in her kind of world, and I thought, oh, I think she's dead.
Bridget.
Yeah. And I just thought, well, I'll keep that to myself. I'm not gonna, but that's what it feels like. So anyway, I then have dinner with Harold and talk about it. And he said, listen, something I should mention, you say, about Bridget. I went, oh. He said, I think she's dead. Well, thank God you said that, because that's what, and then he went off to the loo, and then he came back. He said, I've just realized I made a mistake. Her age, it's the wrong age. The whole point is she can't have got any older. And I think at the time, he'd given her the age, as it were, that the boys were at, and there was this, he said, oh, I can't believe I did that. I have to talk to the publisher. I thought that's really striking. So that, anyway, we had a serious conversation about that, but in the end, it was, it was just the magic of discovery, and Ian Holm, I think that scene when he's wandering around in his pajamas, going bollocks to that one and whatever, and
no fags, no fucks.
That's right. And he got this glass bottle out of the guy, and Ian, as we were sort of working on, he just went, "Cheers," which was not in the play. And Harold was sitting there and he went, "Oh, keep it in." And Ian was sort of so thrilled. He said, I've made a word in a Harold Pinter play. And it was just priceless, you know, a great actor. Harry, I'm going to have to go. Sorry.
I know.
Sorry, but it's great to talk about him and think about him again.
It's been a great joy to hear you sharing so from the heart about him. Thank you so much, David.
No, you're so welcome. Good to see you, and take care of yourself. And if there's anything else you need on it, it's a great project, by the way. You know, just let me know.
I will.
Yeah.
And we're glad we
care.
could share that moment of Biden's electoral announcement.
Yes. Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.